Hello, good evening, everybody. Sorry, my mic seemed to be disabled there, so I hope you can hear me now. My name is Richard Blanco. I'm the chair of Redbridge Landlords Forum, and a very warm welcome to this evening's Landlords Forum. It's great to see so many people attending this evening. We're running from 7 to 9 p.m. tonight. I just want to let you know that we are recording the meeting, and in a moment I'll run through the agenda. Just to let you know that we're very keen to get questions from you. So if you'd like to ask a question, do ask a question using the chat function. I'm just going to share my screen now so that we can see the agenda. I'll just bring this forward for you. There we go. I'm hoping you can see that okay. Right, so we're starting off with a licensing and enforcement update from Cheryl Hart, who's Licence Processing Manager, and Shamal Ali, Housing Standards Team Manager at Redbridge. Then we're looking at increasing housing supply in Redbridge, and that's with Janet Weeks, who's Head of Housing. Now, unfortunately, we've had apologies from Adrian Harding, who's unable to attend this evening, so we're not going to be getting our local plan update, but we are hoping that we can catch up with Adrian at a future meeting. Then I will be doing a regulatory briefing. I'll also be looking at how to raise rents legally and fairly, and I'll be giving you a housing market update as well. And we'll finish off with a presentation from Tim Frome, who's Head of Partnerships at Hamilton Fraser, and he'll be asking the question, are you underinsured? So we'll be looking at some of the issues around that, because of course construction costs have gone up and rebuild costs of properties have gone up, and that could mean that you need to look again at what the rebuild sum insured needs to be for your property. So some interesting stuff there to be looking at with Tim. So I'm just going to unshare now. Let's stop sharing. There we go. And before we get stuck into our agenda, I'd like to introduce Sasha Taylor, who's going to say a few words. Sasha, are you with us?
Thank you, Richard. Yes, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Redbridge Landlord Forum. This is my first forum of the year, and in total, because I've not long been here. I think about 4 months I've been at Redbridge. I've previously at Havering, so some of you may know me from Havering, but I'm the Head of Community Protection and Licensing, and private sector housing comes under my remit. Landlords are very, very important to us at Redbridge. I think we've got around 36,000 privately rented properties in the borough, and we're one of the lowest boroughs with social housing, which Janet will speak a bit more about in her presentation. We've got lots of exciting presentations for you tonight, but yeah, please feel free to put anything in the chat, and any feedback would be great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Sasha. It's great that you're here, and welcome to your first Redbridge Landlords Forum. We hope to see you at many future ones. Okay, well, without further ado, let's go over now to Cheryl Taylor. Sorry, Cheryl Hart.
Cheryl Taylor?
Change your name for you there, Cheryl.
Okay.
Who's Licence Processing Manager, who's going to start off our licensing and enforcement update. Over to you, Cheryl.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. At least we haven't got to go out in the rain. That's one good thing about these team meetings. Right, let me just get in the beginning. Right, so I'm Cheryl Hart. I'm the Property Licensing Processing Manager. Can you all see my screen okay? Is it all right?
Yes, I think you might need to go onto the other setting there. That's it. Brilliant.
That's
Perfect.
It. Okay, lovely. Okay, let me just get this thing out the way. Right. Okay, so just wanted to give you a quick sort of summary of how we did last year. Our financial year finished the 31st of March 2023. If you can look at this graph here, this goes through from the 1st of April 22 through to the end of March 23. The light blue is the completed applications, and the dark blue is how many submitted applications came in. We made a concerted effort over the last few months to try and identify and bring in as many selective licenses as we possibly can, because we know that there's a lot of properties out there still unlicensed, and we did various campaigns, door knocking and mail shots, etc. And as you can see from the results, that there's still quite a healthy number of licenses coming in. 253 came in the month of March alone, so there's still quite a lot of properties coming in. it's still carrying on, and we're still actively looking for unlicensed properties. So there's different ways that good landlords can report people anonymously. We have got an anonymous hotline phone number, which I can put in the chat, and there's also the report it forms on the website that you can also anonymously report anything if you want us to look into anything, because we want to obviously support good landlords and try and identify people who are trying to avoid licensing. And obviously it's not fair. It's you know, we want an even playing field for everybody. So moving on to my next slide, if it let me. There we go. For those who've been with us for a few years, you'll remember that when we started licensing in 2017-18, we had large influx of licenses, and we were literally running at nearly 2 years behind in getting them licensed, because it was this technology wasn't up to scratch, and a lot of it was manual processes. I'm glad to say that currently we're in a much healthier position. Our backlogs are very much down. We've got a few mandatory HMO licenses that are hanging around at the minute, but we're hoping to clear those up soon. But we've got our backlog down very much, and we're at the moment we're negotiating and developing new technology which will make everything faster as far as applying for a license, informing the landlords about applying for a license, and also what documents they need when they apply for a license, trying to make things as much more informative and helpful for both landlords and tenants, and also from the processing side to get the selective licenses turned around very quickly, hopefully within about 6 weeks. You know, hopefully less than 3 months is the target. And with HMOs, we're trying to get them down to 3 months. I think initially it'd be 6 months, and then hopefully we'll get it down to less than that. So we are actively trying to make things quicker and to get licenses processed faster, and so that people aren't hanging around waiting for things and decisions to be made. Just to remind you, currently we've got 2 schemes in place. Selective Scheme 2, which is 14 designated areas of Redbridge, which is in the red shaded areas of the borough. It's mainly all sort of the east and a little bit in the west. And then we've still got obviously the mandatory large HMOs, which is nationwide, a mandatory license, which is 5 or more people forming 2 or more households sharing facilities, and that's borough-wide. That still goes on. We have had consultations over the last year or so. One consultation was on additional licensing, which is basically anything that doesn't fall under selective or mandatory, and it can be small HMOs of up to 4, and it can also be single households, and it can be S257s, which are legal house conversions. So usually all of that comes under additional. At the moment, the additional license has had a public consultation, and feedback has been completed, and people have been answered individually. And the proposal for renewal of this scheme is being taken to Cabinet in June. So hopefully we'll have a decision expected in June in a couple of months. Selective licensing, as at the moment, selective licensing scheme 1, which was Valentine's and Clementswood wards, that expired, and we've currently got 14 wards which are still being licensable up until the 30th of September this year, which is selective scheme 2. What we're proposing is a new scheme to start from the beginning of October, again being taken to Cabinet in June for consideration based on the feedback and the consultation. And if it goes ahead, the scheme 3 will be the 20% of the borough, which doesn't have to get approval from Secretary of State or DULUC. And then scheme 4, depending on what that looks like, it won't be borough-wide, it'll just be a selection of wards if it goes ahead. And that would have to go to DULUC for comment and approval. So that's a long way off yet, because that takes quite some time to get approval if it goes ahead. So again, the Cabinet will be seeing that in June, and hopefully they'll be considering it, and we'll publish what the decisions are once we know them ourselves. That's about it really. Just basically, I think everybody knows how to get hold of us. We've got emails, we've got a phone number. I'll put it in the chat if anybody needs it. Everything's on the website. Please keep an eye on the website, because we do update things like fees, any legislation changes, anything like that is on the website. So please keep an eye on the website, and we have got email addresses you can contact us on, which again I can put in the chat, but it's again it's on the website. That's basically where we're at the moment. And that's me finished. Unless anybody's
Lovely,
got any
thank you.
questions, or
Thank
if
you very
anybody
much,
wants
Cheryl. I think what we'll do is let's take Shamal's presentation now, because that's the
no
second
problem.
half, isn't it, of
Yep,
this slot, and then we'll see
sure.
if we've got any questions, and
No
I'll put them to
problem.
both
No
of you. Yeah,
problem.
lovely,
Okay,
thank
no
you.
worries.
Over
Thank
to
you.
you, Shamal. Oops, I think we're just waiting for Shamal to presentation to come live.
Yeah.
There we go.
Am I sharing?
Yes, we've got your, I think that's slide 2 we're on there, Shamal.
Okay,
Enforcement activity update.
Sorry,
Yeah.
is it
No
on?
worries.
It's on slideshow. Good evening, everyone. I'm Shamal Ali. I'm the Housing Standards Team Manager. I manage the enforcement team within the private sector housing. Tonight, I'm going to give you an update on the enforcement activity that my officers have been working on. I'm just trying to move this away from my screen. These are figures of the activity that the team have been busy doing in the last year. So since April last year, the officers have visited 3,370 properties. We've received over 2,500 service requests. The team have issued over nearly 600 civil penalties. We have 1 prosecution, 43 notice of intentions, and 27 final civil penalties issued. At the bottom of the slide here, you can see the breakdown, and I won't go into detail, but a breakdown of the type of notices that have been served. And just the numbers broken down monthly on the visits that the officers have visited. These graphs you can see shows that it's the south of the borough that appear to be problematic. So our sole purpose, and licensing is a key element in reducing poor housing conditions. It allows us to enforce and raise standards. And what we're mainly looking at is improving poor housing conditions. So through the work that my officers have been doing, we've identified 88 Category 1 hazards, and Category 1 hazards are serious hazards. And the council has a duty to take enforcement action against Category 1 hazards, to rectify them, and for the landlords or the owners of the properties to put them right. We've identified 77 Category 2 hazards. We've resolved 117 Category 1 hazards, and 104 Category 2 hazards have been resolved. And again, the graph showing that the south of the borough seems to be the problematic area. We've streamlined our teams, and I have a team working on proactive work. We've acquired over the last year various internal and external from external databases. And on this sheet, you can see the breakdown of what the proactive team officers have been working on. They've served 38 civil penalties, and this is just the proactive team that are focusing on unlicensed properties, working proactively from the intel received from various data sources. And they've issued 20 final notices. Sorry, this is in the last quarter. And 18 final notices are to be issued in April. So before the end of the month, another 18 final notices will be issued. They've inspected 210 properties in the last quarter. There's been various projects that they've been working on. Cheryl mentioned just a few of them, and on here we've identified from one of the projects 14 licensed properties have been licensed, and 10 undergoing enforcement action. in the first phase of the project. The second phase identified 6 licenses, 3 that were not licensable and 1 enforcement action. And the third phase, 21 properties were licensed, 4 were unlicensable and 4 were taking enforcement action against. And I believe we're in phase 4 now. So the next update I'll bring to you at the next Landlords Forum. In addition to these, we have other projects that the proactive team are working on. So when we have no engagement from owners or landlords, the last option is to obtain a warrant from the magistrate's court. We try and engage with our landlords and the owners of the properties, but as a last resort, we obtain warrants, and we've executed 4 warrants, and the outcome of some of them are formal notices. So here you can see 1 prohibition order. A prohibition order is a closure order of a property. It's uninhabitable. We won't allow people to live in there. 1 improvement notice, and CPNs and prosecutions to follow. We also work with our internal partners and the police on brothels operating from HMOs. We've had 3 operations, and we've gone through 20 properties have been inspected, and some CPNs have been issued on those. In addition to that, we continually, routinely join our police partners and internal antisocial behaviour team. In the last couple of months, we've been on 2 operations, and we've identified unlicensed properties that we're taking action on. And also we've got a programme of inspecting properties early morning unannounced where we believe the properties are suspected to be unlicensed. This is a graph that looks similar to what Cheryl's run through. This one relates to the projects that we've been working on. We're in the last year of our Scheme 2 licensing scheme, and there's a real big drive on identifying all the unlicensed properties. And as a result of our proactive work, our mail shots, and our enforcement intervention, you can see clearly that the license applications have gone up, and we are continuing to work. The enforcement team and the processing team are both working together to drive up those numbers to try and license as many properties as we can before the end of the scheme. Oops, sorry. I've got some case studies here for you. I won't go through all of them. I'll let you read them at your leisure. But just a quick overview on this one. This is a converted garage with no planning or building regulations. It didn't have a license. The officer went out and found Category 1 hazards. So unsafe. There was some fire hazards, damp and mould, inadequate ventilation, etc. We served a prohibition order. We'll be issuing a civil penalty on the owner and the managing agent of this property. It's another unlicensed property. I'll let you read that at your leisure. Again, a Cat 1 hazard and improvement notice was served on this one. We're issuing financial penalties for failure to license. Another one identified by the proactive team, unlicensed HMO, and you can see the beds here. So overcrowding, severe overcrowding, and they were also sleeping in the loft in this property. So we prohibited the loft. We've served improvement notices, and we've issued some civil penalties. Our priorities for the enforcement team remains the overall priority to ensure that rented properties are safe for our residents in the borough, resolving Category 1 hazards that pose threat to imminent life or limb, damp and mould in the since the winter. has been a priority for us. We endeavour to inspect properties within 3 days. And related to that later on in the list here is vulnerable tenants. So when we're out inspecting, we're always identifying vulnerable tenants and ensuring that they are signposted for support wherever they're needed. Mandatory HMOs are the biggest risk, so they're a priority. Additional HMOs are also high risk, so they're a priority. Ensuring that the landlords that we license are fit and proper. And we continue to review our processes and procedures to streamline the enforcement activities. We recently reviewed our enforcement policy. It has been publicly consulted on, and we're reviewing the comments at the moment, and hopefully the document will go to Cabinet in the summer. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat or email us. That all our details are on the website, as Cheryl said. There's a report it form if anybody wants to report an unlicensed property, or your tenants want to report disrepair or any issues. The forms and information and advice sheets are on our website. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shimol. And I think, it's obviously really important, the enforcement action that you and your team undertake, because that's the kind of thing that brings the whole sector into disrepute. And, we really need to deal with landlords who think it's reasonable to rent those kinds of properties. We should remind people, of course, though, we're not suggesting that everyone at this meeting has properties like that. Obviously, most of us are as appalled to hear about those case studies as I'm sure you and your colleagues are, Shimol. So there's an element of you preaching to the converted in many ways in this, isn't it? You're just making us aware. Yeah,
absolutely. I must add, though, all of these cases, we initially attempt to work with landlords informally. They usually receive 2 letters before we start taking enforcement action. But if they're unlicensed and they're HMOs and they're dangerous, then we go straight into enforcement, because they should have been licensed already.
Yes, and of course it's worth reminding landlords that if you have an HMO that's not licensed and should be, that the tenants could reclaim the last 12 months rent.
They can,
which
yes.
would certainly hit landlords very hard in the pocket, and does do, as they're called rent repayment orders. Yeah. And it's good to hear, Shimol, that you will work with landlords, because obviously occasionally people may have overlooked things or just misunderstood, and if that landlords can then rectify that quickly, I think obviously it's only sensible to work with them to do that and not be too heavy-handed. So I'm pleased to hear that you take that approach.
Absolutely. I mean, I brought some case studies in during the previous landlords forum, where the officers worked with landlords to rectify and brought the properties up to compliance. So it's not all about enforcement. We do try informally. It's only as a last resort where we have to bring, the law tells us that we've got to bring these properties up to compliance, and that's where enforcement action is taken.
Yes, of course. Yeah. There's a question, it's this question for Cheryl, but the question is, how many successful prosecutions were there last year? Can you
So I've noted one. It's the reason for that is that these CPNs have gone up and the prosecutions have gone down. We have one in the process, and resource is an issue within the team. So we're building up our resources so that the prosecutions will start picking up. With enforcement, we have a panel that decides whether the case should follow the route of a CPN or prosecution.
CPN's a civil penalty notice,
Civil penalty,
isn't it? Yes,
notice,
which can be up to 30,000. Is that right? Yeah,
that's correct. Yes.
Yes, okay. And this is one of the challenges facing local authorities, of course, that prosecutions are very involved and quite expensive. And so it can be very resource intensive for local authorities to go down that route. So we should remember that, just to remind people. There was a question about, can the slides be shared? And just to remind everyone that the video of this webinar does get published afterwards on the website, so it will all be there for you to look through again. We did have some feedback that the text was a bit too small to read some of those slides, Shamal. So that just perhaps something to think about.
I think we can share the slides. I apologize for the text being small. They're case studies that my officers have given me, and I had to fit them in on the slides, and I couldn't cut them down anymore. I tried.
No, I understand. It's great to see the detail, but we probably might need to see the stack of slides as a whole. I don't know if it's possible to publish those on the website, but maybe we can look at that. We've had one or two complaints about, you know, people feeling over-regulated and licenses are expensive and they regret very much all of this regulation. And that is a common complaint from landlords. And I will talk a bit more about that in my presentation. Generally, landlords are not very keen on licensing schemes, and but of course, once they're in place, we do have to cooperate, and you know, we hope that local authorities will have a light touch with good landlords, good compliant landlords, and focus their resources on those that don't comply. Yeah, there's a question over whether people need to apply for the license when it expires, or will the council contact me to renew? And I think people are a bit confused about when the new schemes might start. I don't know if that's a question for you, Shamal, or for Cheryl.
Cheryl will be able. They will need to reapply. It's a renewal, but Cheryl will be able to give you further details.
Yes.
The only licensing scheme that actually is automatically renewable is a mandatory. That's the only one that everybody, if you've got a mandatory license and expires or due to expire, you must reapply because it's mandatory, it's nationwide, and it's a mandatory license. Selective schemes, additional schemes are all optional to councils. We can't just let a selective scheme finish and then just reintroduce it. We have to go to public consultation, provide evidence, and then for large schemes, go to the Secretary of State or DULUC to get to prove why we feel we want licensing, and they will make the ultimate decision whether they will let us have it or not. So the only part that we can actually do without having to go to DULUC is the 20% of the borough were allowed to have selective licensing without having to go to DULUC. But anything above 20%, we have to get approval, and it does take 6 months, 8 months to get approval, or it can come back refused. Some boroughs get them refused. It all depends on what the evidence and the evidence provided to show if we've made a difference or not by having licensing in Redbridge. Same thing with additional. That's basically it's in our gift, if you like, to introduce additional. But again, we have to have public consultation. We have to have evidence based, and then it's the cabinet, the Redbridge cabinet, who will decide if we're going to go ahead with additional and how it should look.
Is there a plan, Cheryl, to have early bird discounts with the new schemes, or do we not know that yet?
I don't actually know the answer to that at this moment in time. I think there's been proposals, but I don't know what the actual outcome is at this moment in time.
Okay, and that has become quite common amongst local authorities. So obviously we will hope for that. And as Cheryl was saying, with discretionary licensing, selective or additional, they can run for a maximum of 5 years, and then effectively the next scheme is a new one. So, but landlords will be informed, I guess, through the newsletter, through
we will advertise. Everybody who's had a license with us before, we will be able to automatically email when anything happens and changes. But just be wary that obviously if anybody's changed their email address or moved address and hasn't told us, then obviously we might be emailing somebody who doesn't actually respond or doesn't actually receive the email because they've changed, you know, their broadband account or whatever. So please keep an eye on our website. June there should be some answers. So if you look at sort of late June, early July, then hopefully we'll be able to give you more information on where we're going with it. But there will be another forum in October, which is quite timely because obviously if anything is, that's when selective scheme 2 would have finished in September. So October will be quite key because the chances are if anything's been agreed, it will be coming in roughly from October onwards.
Okay, thank you very much, Cheryl.
All right.
Jane says, so far the forum is all anti-landlord. I signed up because I thought it was supposed to be helpful. Well, Jane, we're starting this forum with council-led items, and licensing enforcement is one of them. And we will be looking at regulatory stuff and campaigns from me shortly, and also a more business-orientated item, which is about insurance. So I hope you'll stick with us. Okay, let's move on to our next item now. So I'm pleased to welcome Janet Weeks, who's Head of Housing Needs. And Janet's going to be talking to us about increasing housing supply in Redbridge. Good evening, Janet.
Good evening and welcome everyone. I will apologise now as I do have a couple of slides that the writing might be a bit small, so I'll apologise in advance. just share my presentation. Hopefully everybody can see that. So my name's Janet Weeks, I'm Head of Housing Needs, and the actual service area that I manage consists of 3 teams. This is Housing Solutions and Rough Sleeping. That first team, they deal with homelessness, so all of the front door in terms of preventing and relieving homelessness, giving general housing advice. And from the 1st of March last year to the 31st of March this year, they dealt with 1,302 homelessness applications. Compared to the previous year, that's gone up quite significantly by 207. They also work with partners to reduce the number of individuals who maybe sleeping rough in the borough and on the streets, and also provide support to prevent a return to the streets. The second team is the housing supply team. They administer the housing register that enables local residents to access social housing. They also deal with allocations and lettings of properties, so council properties and housing association properties. And they also manage all of the temporary accommodation where we place households who are homeless. We also work with landlords and managing agents in terms of acquiring private rented sector properties, and also use that to discharge our homelessness duties. So in terms of some stats around that, the last year, the team dealt with 108 social lettings. The housing register currently has 7,614 applicants on there, and compared to the previous year, the 6,858. So as you will see, we've got small number of lettings every year. We've got quite a large housing register, and again, another year, and you've seen an increase. In terms of temporary accommodation, we currently have just over 2,900 households in temporary accommodation. I will show you a slide shortly that does show the increase in that. And that particular team, they also acquired 128 assured short hold tenancies and also nightly lets and private sector lease properties. The last team with regards to the housing needs service is the housing reviews and service improvement team. And they manage and complete reviews that may come in terms of a decision that's made in terms of if someone's applied to come onto the housing register and they don't qualify and they have a right for review. So that review would go into this team. Or if somebody's homelessness decision has been a negative decision, they would ask for a review and it would go into this team who would carry out the review. This team also deals with the local government ombudsman complaints, and they share best practice across the team in terms of service improvements. What that team also has seen is an increase in litigation cases with emerging things such as mould and damp, which obviously has increased since the death of the child in Rochdale Council. So just quickly showing you some stats with regards to temporary accommodation. As you'll see, the temporary accommodation numbers, they are going up. So starting off in the first year, and this is a financial year, starting off with 2,787. And then by the end of March this year, it was 2,962. So as you can see, it's gradually been creeping up. Okay, so just looking at the current issues that are impacting the lack of supply, some of this you probably will already be aware of. There was the eviction ban that was introduced during the coronavirus, and that has been lifted. But this has seen an increase in possession orders and evictions. And for Redbridge, the last financial year, there was an increase of 36% in possession orders and evictions going through the court. This has then led to an increase in homelessness presentations on the day of the eviction. So rather than households coming to us earlier, they're coming to us later. And there's also been an increase, obviously, because this has had an impact on us having to provide them with emergency accommodation. There's not enough housing to meet the demand. And with an estimated growth of 10% by 2030 to over 330,000 in terms of the population of Redbridge, and a lack of supply, you can see that there's obviously an urgent issue with regards to supply. Other factors that need to be taken into consideration, that's a current issue for us, is legislation. So the Domestic Abuse Act came into force in 2021. So we've seen an increase in presentations from people who are fleeing and are victims of domestic abuse. There's also been changes in terms of immigration around the Ukraine and Afghans, again, and the Home Office, who have been using accommodation in the borough as part of the asylum dispersal scheme, which has then added to the lack of supply that was already there and the council being able to access it. We also have the cost of living crisis, which we're all aware of. So the basics such as food, gas, electric, all going up, and wages not remaining the same, or in some cases, reducing in real terms. So then that does create an issue in terms of affordability. The recent spring budget, unfortunately, didn't address this ongoing issue around affordability, and there weren't any changes made either to the local housing allowance, which would support local residents who need a home, but obviously are struggling with the rent in terms of the private rented sector. The government did, however, and still does provide cost of living grants, and also with the DWP in terms of things like the Household Support Fund that residents can apply for. So these emerging issues, along with an increase in our homelessness and use of temporary accommodation, has had a result in terms of the council having to use commercial hotels to meet our statutory homelessness duty, and the increase in lack of supply, which is obviously having a big impact. This slide does show what I was talking about in terms of the estimated increase in private landlord evictions. As you'll see, this is over a 5-year period here. Redbridge being the orange line. And as you'll see, it tapered off, but there was dips and increases. And again, looking over the other side, you can see where there's obviously an increase in the evictions. So how can we increase supply? Well, by working with yourselves as our landlords to try and secure more properties. The council does need to put more investment into accommodation and brokering deals, and also longer term partnerships so that we can continue to work together on opportunities. And we're also buying homes as part of our P&R programme. So in terms of what can the council offer yourselves as landlords? So our acquisitions team do deal with landlords and managing agents and do provide a personalised service. Also, your rent can be paid obviously on time, so there's obviously no issues with that. And access to our landlord offer, which I'll go through shortly, and also longer term partnership opportunities, such as long lease arrangements. And as I said, continuing just to buy homes. In terms of what we can offer, so as I said before, a personalised service from our acquisitions team, incentives to landlords who offer us 12 or 24 months tenancies. The incentives at the moment are £1,000 for studios, £2,000 for 1 beds, and £4,000 and upwards for 2, 3s and 4 beds. In addition, we do continue to offer 1 month deposit bond and 1 month rent in advance. So how can you help? We do need to increase the supply of accommodation in the borough. and more so self-contained properties. Does anybody have any questions for me?
Thank you very much, Janet. And just to say that, because I think there's one or two remarks about supply, I will be covering the issue of supply and what's happening to that in my presentation as well, because it's a big issue at the moment in the private rented sector and for landlords in general. We've got, what is the current rent you pay for 2 and 1 bedroom flats? Presumably it's the LHA rates.
Correct. Yes.
Is that correct, Janet?
Yes.
So, and you can find those by going, if you just Google LHA calculator,
and it will bring it up.
It'll bring it up and you can see what that is. Yeah. And yes, Peter, we'll talk about over-regulation and the other factors that are causing landlords to sell up shortly. See if there's anything else here. How many properties have the council purchased is a question here from Simon. Janet.
Oh, so the last financial year, we purchased just under 80 properties.
Okay, right, yeah. And Redbridge is a borough with a lot less social housing than some other comparable boroughs, isn't it, Janet? So you do have a particular challenge in Redbridge.
Yeah, with our own housing stock in roughly in the region of about 4,000. If you think about it, there's only about 110 lettings a year. You've got a housing register with 7,400 households on it. You know, supply and demand aren't matching up. And when you put in factors such as, you know, other competition and the lack of supply, obviously other issues as well, it really is an issue for us, which is why I'm kind of really pleading to landlords to come to us if they have any properties they'd like to give to us and work with
yes, and I wish the government would come up with tax incentives or some kind, you know, like CGT rollover relief, or, you know, those are the sorts of things that have been suggested, tax incentives that could be given to landlords who let to the social sector, you know, via people like yourself, Janet. That would be great. We've got another question here. What guarantee is there that landlords will get their property back in the same condition if the council was given a high-end property? Well, this is often a general anxiety, isn't it, Janet? The condition that the property might be given back in at the end of the lease. What reassurance can you give landlords around that?
Well, if we do it on a lease basis, we obviously do have an inventory. And so we would be handing the property back in the same condition that we took it on in. And we'd obviously use the inventory to obviously compare and make sure that it does go back in the same condition that it was given to. I understand there are anxieties around tenant damage and things, but obviously we would ensure that the property is handed back in the same condition that was handed to us in the first place. The only exception to that is normal wear and tear, which you know, everybody's used to. But apart from that, you know, we would use the inventory as you know, ensuring that the conditions were recorded and everybody's happy in terms of the way we've took it on and the way we've handed it back.
Okay. Yes. So there'll be an inventory, and if there were damage, presumably would the council repair the damage, or what would happen?
Yes, so if there was damage and it wasn't reported, but we still do carry out inspections as well. So if there was damage, then obviously the damage would be sorted out as well. So it still goes back to the same thing in terms of on the inventory, that's the basis of obviously the start of taking the property on. And then at the end, we go back to the inventory again. Okay,
yeah. And there's a question here about saying landlords want to give properties to the council, but the processing agent you have don't let it get through and pay landlords very low rent. I guess I was going to address that issue of low rent because the LHA rent, the rate is below market rent. But what landlords need to do is factor in that incentive payments that you give at the beginning.
Correct.
So if you add that to say 12 months of the lower rent, you end up with a kind of bigger sum overall. So that's the way really that landlords should think about it. Yes, you are getting a lower LHA rate than the market rent, but you are also getting that incentive payment, which could be as much as £4,000. That's right, isn't it, Janet?
Yeah, or more.
Or more, yes, yeah. So don't forget that. Right. Yes, you're right to hear the LHA rates are not keeping up with rising rents. And this is a point that the NRLA is campaigning on. LHA rates have been frozen. I think it's since 2021, April 2021. And the NRLA says that they shouldn't be frozen, that they should keep pace with market rents. In London, 25% of landlords used to let to tenants on benefits. Now that's down to 7%. Partly because, you know, LHA rates have not kept up with market rents, but also because the rent does not get paid directly to the landlord. But presumably in this case, there's no question, you know, the rent gets paid directly to the landlord, doesn't it, Janet?
And there is a mechanism for doing that, depending on the circumstances. So you can get assistance with doing a safeguarding form if it does need to be paid direct to the landlord. So there are conversations to be had in terms
Yes,
of what
and
other
that's
mechanisms you can do to do that.
that's yes, well that's good. Yeah, that's good to hear. And I forget what the term is that's used in universal credit for it's something payments, isn't it? When it's paid directly to the landlord, and there is a list of circumstances in which
Correct, yeah.
the payment can be made direct to the landlord. Yes. So at the end of the lease, does the landlord get vacant possession of the property the tenant leaves? Is that right, Janet?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. And the council would be responsible for repairs during the period of the lease. That's another question that's been asked.
It depends, because there's a number of ways in which that the lease can be set up. It can either be set up that the managing agent sorts out the repairs, or with the council. So this is why it's all about, you know, what is it that, you know, the landlord wants to have in terms of that lease, having that discussion, being clear about which one they're happy with, and then obviously, you know, from those conditions, that's the way it would go forward.
So it can be tailored to meet the needs of the landlord, it sounds. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much, Janet, for your presentation. And, you know, to remind landlords that you're really helping out if you do provide properties to Janet and the local authority, because there are good tenants in need, and it does mean that you get a regular rent and also the support of the local authority in managing the property. So do get in touch if that's something you would like to do. And remember, yes, the LHA rate is lower, but you do get that incentive payment, so that makes up the difference. Yeah.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Janet. Thanks very much. Right. I can see there are quite a lot of questions on licensing, but Cheryl and Shamal have been busy answering those. So I think it's probably best to leave you to continue answering those if you're okay, Cheryl and Shamal, with that. And I will move on now to my presentation. So let me bring that up. Just give me a moment. Hopefully we can bring that up quite quickly. There we go. So I'm looking now at the regulatory briefing and market update. So I'm hoping that you can see that okay. And if I don't hear from you, I'm assuming you can see it, and I will continue. This is what I'm going to be looking at. We're going to be talking about raising rents fairly and legally, first of all. So I'll do a little slot on that because that's quite a topical issue at the moment. I'll also be looking at government consultation on short-term lets. We'll be doing a quick update on the renters reform white paper, just to check you're all up to date on the plans on that. There's a new how to rent booklet out, so I'll just be reminding you on that. The latest on the minimum energy efficiency standards, making tax digital, quick look at new fire safety measures, a reminder of the smoke and carbon monoxide alarms regulations if you're not aware of those. Reminder as well on right to rent changes, so I shall whiz through those just to check everyone's up to date on them, and then we'll look at a housing market update. And I'll ask the question, is now a good time to invest in property? It was the Property Investor Show actually this last weekend at Excel, so quite interesting meeting new investors there and asking those sorts of questions, asking and examining those sort of questions. Let's start by looking at raising rents fairly and legally. Well, UK rents have gone up by 11%, that's new lets, in the last 12 months. The Office of National Statistics figure is 4.7%, so that includes all lets, so including tenants that are in situ. That is actually a record since the index began in 2016. So we are seeing rents go up more than they have done in the past. I'll answer that the question why in a moment, but just to say also that available properties have fallen by a third in the last 18 months, and the BBC did a whole feature on this a few weeks ago. I'm not sure if you caught that on Radio 4 or on BBC News. Why are rents rising? Well, the principal reason is the short supply and high demand. So demand's up more than 50% over where it normally is, according to Zoopla. And Zoopla also say that 11% of homes that are for sale on the Zoopla platform were previously rented. NRLA research tells us that 30% of landlords are thinking of selling in the next 12 months. One of the things that's driving them away is increased mortgage costs, with bank base rate currently at 4.25%, and we think it may go up again to 4.5 on the 11th of May and 4.75% on the 22nd of June. It's interesting to note that 64% of landlords don't put up their rents whilst the existing tenants are in situ, and that's NRLA research from a couple of years ago. And also, of course, what's affecting supply is the fact that landlords are starting to sell up. And I'll talk about that later on when we look at the housing market. Let's focus now on raising rents and the law on this. So there are three main kinds of tenancies that we use in the private rented sector. The main one, of course, is short hold tenancies. These are for a fixed period. The minimum is typically 6 months, and that's because you can't serve a Section 21 notice until month 4. So effectively, once the tenants are in on an AST, they've got a minimum of 6 months. Typically in London, of course, we do 12-month ASTs. Sometimes agents push us to do 3 years, because they hope they might get more commission out of that, etc. And that can be in the tenant's benefit, but I often think 12 months is a good period just to see how things go, and a year is a good period to manage things, I think. You cannot raise the rent during the fixed term. Longer ASTs may have a rent review clause. So say it's a 3-year AST, it may say that the rent will go up by X% every year. I'm not very keen on those sorts of tenancy agreements. I don't recommend them. I think it's better to end the tenancy after 12 months and then renegotiate and start a new tenancy. That's the cleanest and simplest way to do it, really. And I'll come on to that in a bit more detail shortly. Now, statutory periodic tenancy, that's when your 12 months has come to an end and then the contract rolls on. So it rolls on usually on a month-by-month basis. That's if you're taking monthly rent. Let's assume you're doing, if you're taking rent monthly, which is what most landlords do, and let's assume that's what you're doing. Now, if you want to increase the rent when you've gone into that statutory periodic period, say the tenant's been there for 2 or 3 years, and you issue a Section 13 with 1 month's notice, and the tenant either accepts the rent increase or ends the contract and gives notice, or they can go to a tribunal. The tribunal could decide that the rent should be higher or lower than whatever the landlord proposed. I'll say a bit more about that shortly. With contractual periodic tenancies, which we don't use very often, these are ones that don't have a fixed period. They just go month by month right from the start. If they have a rent review clause, then you can use a Section 13 notice as laid down in the clause, and the clause will spell out how that can be used. And when the rent increase takes effect, the contract will then become a statutory periodic tenancy. It's all a bit technical. I would suspect very few of you will have contractual periodic tenancies. Most people have a short hold tenancy. And if you choose to let it roll on beyond the initial year or however long the fixed term is, it will become a statutory periodic tenancy. Now, about the Section 13 notices, so this is a prescribed form, and there's a picture of it there or some of it on the right. It's available on the government website, and it also provides details on the form of the notice periods, etc. So it's quite formal in its nature. It's normally 1 month's notice, but say in an unusual situation, if you take the rent every 3 months, then it'll be 3 months notice. Or if you take the rent every 6 months, it'll be 6 months notice. So the notice period does depend on what the rental period is. It's usually served on the rent due date. So say you take the rent on the 10th of the month and you serve it on the 10th. And you would either serve it at the end of the fixed period. So, on the 10th, 1 month before the end of the period, to say, look, I want to put the rent up in 1 month's time, and then you can carry on as a statutory periodic tenancy. or a minimum of 12 months into a contractual periodic tenancy. So if you start off as a contractual periodic, you can't increase the rent until 12 months in, and then you would serve a Section 13 notice, or 12 months after the last Section 13 notice was served. So in effect, there's a sort of, you can only have an increase once a year with a Section 13 notice. The rent rise will go ahead unless the tenant disputes it. So the tenant doesn't actually have to formally accept it. It's only if they dispute it that it won't go ahead. The tenant can dispute the rent, as I say, by applying to a tribunal, and they use Form 6, and the tribunal will then make a judgment, and it is based on market rents. So the risk the tenant runs is that you might have said 1,200 and the tribunal might say, actually, the market rent is 1,300. So the tenant does run that risk. If you're using a Section 13 notice and you're stuck, do call the NRLA advice line. There's the number. Obviously, you do have to be an NRLA member to use that. Now, I would say best practice on raising rents. It's always best, I think, to use a 12-month assured short of tenancy. That way, you know when it's going to end, you can manage it. I always talk to the tenant 3 months before the end of the tenancy, ask them what their plans are, and then if I have plans to increase the rent, I try to give them 3 months notice at least, just so that, you know, if it's going to be difficult for them and it doesn't suit them, then they've got a good 3 months to kind of, decide what they want to do and find another property. Now, do you have a rent policy? I do, and I tell tenants I review rents every 2 years, and then I use market comparables. I don't usually increase the rent to the market rent. I'd usually increase it, by a small amount to take account of inflation or my increased costs. But it does depend on the situation. At the moment, for example, my mortgages are going up by 32% this year, but I've only been increasing rents by about £100. In the past, I've increased them by £50 every couple of years, but I've said to tenants, I'm sorry, but my costs are going up so much that I'm afraid I am having to put rents up by £100. What I am doing is making sure I give them 3 or 4 months notice. And in fact, I've given somebody 1 year's notice that I'll be putting the rent up by £150 so that, they know well in advance. So, I would say feel free to give tenants 6 or 12 months notice of proposed increases so they can really think and plan ahead. A tenant complained to me today that I'm proposing a £100 increase, and I did remind him I haven't increased his rent for 5 years. His rent's currently 1,650. The market rent is probably 2,300 in his area, and I'm increasing it to 1,750. So, I'm sorry to have to do that in a time of difficulty like now, but he's still getting a very good deal. And, as I say, my mortgage costs are going up exponentially. Now, with rents falling below market rent, the tricky thing is, consider the cost of a void and possible redecoration. I've got a property in Walthamstow, the rent's 2,050, the market rent's probably 2,200. If the tenants moved out, I probably needed to redecorate and maybe do some improvements, and then I'd probably have had a month's void. So that could have cost me anything up to £6,000, £7,000, £8,000. And, if I get a new tenant in at 2,200, then that's 150 a month. So, it's probably cheaper to keep existing tenants in and lose that 150 a month. So that's the sort of calculation you have to think about. Weigh this up weigh the cost of a void and redec up against keeping the same tenant at below market rent. And I think always increase rent by a reasonable amount and explain to the tenant your situation. The best time to reset to market rent, of course, is when the tenant moves out. I have a particular issue with this because tenants will stay with me for 10 years, which is great. And I really like all of my tenants, get on very well with them, but it can be a challenge trying to pull rents closer to market rent. But as I say, you need to weigh up the costs of a void and redecoration. And also sometimes, I don't like the expression very much, but better the devil, sometimes it's better to keep the existing tenant, even though they are paying a bit below market rent, because you have a good relationship with them. So moving on to other issues, the consultation on short-term lets. The government issued this recently. It's running until the 7th of June 2023. They've proposed a definition of what a short let would be. And if you want to Google this, just Google government consultation on short-term lets, and you can see what that proposed definition is. It talks about hosts and guests and temporary, that it's temporary, it's not the guest permanent place of residence and so on. The government wants to know if we think that things like tree houses and so on would constitute short-term lets. And so, you know, there's quite a lot of stuff in there that it goes into that you might be interested in if this is a particular area of interest. It asks, should we be, if we have a register, which it wants to have, should we be registering the person or the property? And should it be registered with the tourist board or with local authorities? What might the level of fees be? Would we expect the tourist board or the local authorities to carry out inspections? Would we allow them to enforce minimum standards? How onerous might that be? How onerous should it be, etc.? So all that's up for grabs at the moment, and the government's keen to hear what you think if you're interested in short-term lets, or indeed run some at the moment. Scotland does have a licensing scheme at the moment, which started very recently this April, and Wales is also considering one. And it's worth pointing out to you as well that Wales local authorities can charge 300% council tax now, which is very onerous for people doing short-term lets. In England, from April 2024, local authorities will be able to charge 200% council tax. I did speak to a lot of people at the Property Investor Show who said they're thinking of doing short-term lets. Do go into it with your eyes wide open, because, you know, this could become very expensive. And, you know, we don't know how bureaucratic and expensive registration could be. The other side of this is the government wants to introduce a new use class of C5. Now, currently C3 is a dwelling house with a family in it. C4 is an HMO with 3 or more people in 2 or more households. So C5 would be a new planning use class, which would be a short-term let. Now, the idea is that, as at the moment, you would have permitted development rights from C3 to C4 or C5. So you would be able to change your house from a family to sharers or to a short-term let as you wish, unless the local authority brings in an Article 4 direction. Now, that is the case, of course, in Redbridge around C4. You can't let to sharers unless you've got planning permission, unless you had sharers in the property before the Article 4 came into force. So the same would apply with C5. If the local authority chooses to bring in an Article 4 direction, then you would be required to get planning permission to have short-term lets. So that will be down to each local authority to decide. And when it grants planning permission, it could attach conditions like a maximum of 90 days and so on. Currently, the law in London is quite particular. In London boroughs, you do have the right to let on a short-term basis for up to 90 days. So I think the government's also consulting on that, whether that should stay in force or whether that should change. Quick catch up on the Renters Reform Bill. So this isn't new. Those of you who are aware of this white paper that came out last June, I think it was, I'll just whiz through this to check everybody knows. So short hold tenancies are going to be replaced by periodic tenancies. They will effectively be lifelong, and the tenant will be able to end them by giving 2 months notice. The landlord can end the tenancy using a Section 8, so no fault Section 21 eviction will be abolished. There will be new grounds for selling up. If you want to sell the property or move in, you'll have to give the tenant 2 months notice, and you won't be able to let the property for 3 months once the tenant has left. The existing short tenancies will last for a maximum of 12 months into the new system, and there'll be a maximum of 1 rent increase allowed per annum, which can be challenged at the tribunal as it can be now, except the tribunal won't be able to propose a higher rent than what the landlord has proposed. It would only be either that rent or a lower one. Of course, we've argued that abolishing Section 21 is very dangerous without modernising the courts. Government said the eviction process was meant to be digitised by 2023, and we still await that. We've also got to be members of a compulsory redress scheme, and there'll be an ombudsman and possible mediation options. We'll no longer be able to advertise no families or no DSS, and pets will not be allowed to be unreasonably refused, although that is currently the situation at the moment anyway. There'll be a decent home standard for the private rented sector. You'll be pleased to know that's not too onerous, and we don't think that's going to be difficult for many landlords. Most of us will comply with that fairly easily. And there will be a property portal where we will be required to upload compliance documents like gas safety certificates and so on. And it will also be an area for support and advice, and will also collate local authority data and help with local authority enforcement. Now, the timescale on this, Michael Gove held a meeting with stakeholders, including the NRLA, last week. And so he's told groups confidentially what he's thinking of doing. We were expecting to see a bill in Parliament this session. Some people are saying it's not going to be to the autumn now, so we're still not sure what exactly the timescale is. We have been assured that we'll be given 6 months' notice before the new system comes in. So I suspect the earliest we could see the new system is spring 2024. Probably 2025 is more feasible, but remember there will be a general election before January 2025. So, you know, the question as to whether or not they'll be able to push it through quickly enough. The consultation on the Decent Home Standards has completed, so that's been done. A working group's been set up on antisocial behaviour provisions because there are concerns that they're not strong enough. And also there's concern in the student sector because students will also have periodic tenancies, which will be ongoing. They won't be fixed. The purpose-built sector will be exempt, but a lot of people are saying it's not fair that student landlords won't be able to do the 9-month or 12-month ASTs that they currently do. And ministers have said that they will look into this. There was a DLUC committee report that said that they thought student tenancies should be exempted. So the NRLA were pleased because that's what we said. They also unfortunately said that the sale or moving grounds should be changed so that, yes, you can give 2 months notice, but you can't then relet for 6 months. And also you wouldn't be able to use that ground until the tenant has been in the property for 1 year. We're hoping that it doesn't get changed like that, because obviously that makes it more onerous for landlords. They also said there should be a specialist housing court. Fantastic to see that the Housing Select Committee said that taxes need to be reviewed for landlords because they're not fair, and that's, you know, we're brilliant to hear that from politicians, though I feel like we're really making some progress on that now. Whether the government will take any notice, of course, is another thing. And of course they've also said that house building needs to be increased to at least the 300,000 a year, and that should include at least 95,000 social houses a year. So in summary, what the NRLA is calling for, we want an end to anti-landlord rhetoric and for the government to back quality landlords. We want them to address issues in the student market. We don't think indefinite tenancies are the way forward there. We want them to establish firm principles on tackling antisocial tenants quickly and effectively, to reform the courts before Section 21 powers are removed. And also we'd like to see the property portal abolish discretionary licensing, that's local licensing like selective and additional licensing. We think if landlords are uploading all of their details to the property portal, that should be sufficient to mean that we don't need licensing schemes at local authorities, and we're hoping that the government will take our suggestions on board with that. So moving on to other issues, the How to Rent Guide has been updated. It's the March 2023 version. You must give this to the tenant at the start of any new tenancy or on renewal for tenancies in England. There's a quick checklist there of things that have been added: carbon monoxide stuff, electrical safety reports, and the stuff on smart meters and accessibility. And you can download that. Just Google Government How to Rent Guide. Make sure you give the tenant the latest one. If in doubt, if you think you might have given them the wrong one, just give them the latest one now. Just make sure they've got it. And looking at the minimum energy efficiency standards, well, the government consultation ended on this in January 2021. Can you believe it? 2 years ago. A question was tabled in the House of Commons in the last couple of weeks, I think, and Graham Stewart, the minister, said that they will respond by the end of this year. So it could end up being nearly 3 years before we get a response. Now, I would say don't be confused by the Minimum Energy Performance of Buildings Bill. This is a private member's bill that's going through Parliament, and I'm assured by our policy team that this is very unlikely to be enacted. I think Mortgages for Business sent out an email, I got one, to everyone saying, oh, we now know what's happening because this is what this bill says. This bill's a private member's bill and it's not going to happen. So very foolish of them to do that. And what I would say to you is, if you want accurate information, go to the NRLA, because we're very rigorous about making sure we give you the correct information. All we know so far is what the consultation said, which was that our properties would have to be up to EPC C by 2025, for new tenants or 2028 for existing tenancies. We think this is highly unlikely now. We've asked the government to extend the deadline to 2028 for all properties, so we'll see what they say. The maximum contribution was proposed to be 10,000 by the landlord. If it's going to cost more to get it up to a ceiling that, you can apply to have it on the exemption register, and you just self-search for that, so it's not particularly onerous. NRLA research tells us the average cost is 8,300 per property. And we've made some suggestions there. We want a clear timetable for response. As I say, we suggested 2028. And the delay, of course, is causing uncertainty, and I would argue planning blight. If we look at some stats here, 27% of landlords say they would rather sell than carry out any works. So, you know, they're kind of in a limbo at the moment. 60% said they would only buy a property which is C or above at the moment because they think C is going to be what the government's going to set. 50% are thinking of selling properties that are D or below. Only 44.5% of PRS properties have an EPC of C or higher. It was 18% 10 years ago, so we are getting a lot better. But the main issue is that a third of properties in the private rented sector are pre-1919. That's why so many private rented sector properties are below a C. There are 13 points between a D and a C, and it's quite challenging for older properties to get from D to C. I certainly am finding that with Victorian properties, and I'm sure many of you are, and this is why I think a C is going to be quite problematic. So moving on, just reminding you that Making Tax Digital is coming down the line. We will have to make quarterly digitised tax returns to HMRC. It's a bit like VAT returns. The plan was for landlords with a gross rental income over 10,000 to start to have to do this next year, would you believe it? But the NRLA requested a change to timing and limits, and the government has followed through on this. It's changed to 2026 for landlords with a gross rental income over 50,000 and 2027 for landlords with a gross rental income over 30,000. Just to make you aware, there was a consultation on council tax disaggregation. This is where you've got rooms in a property that you let by the room, and the Valuation Office Agency has said that you must have a council tax bill for each room. It's causing a lot of problems, and that's why the government has been consulting on this, and we're hoping that they will stop the VOA from doing this. Moving on quickly to fire safety regulations. So there are some new regs that came in on the 23rd of January 2023. In effect, freeholders of blocks of flats, mixed use dwellings such as shops with a flat above, and HMO landlords who let properties by the room. So this is not shared house HMOs. And interestingly, it can also be properties where there are just 2 rooms. So even if there are just 2 people in, as long as the rooms in the property are let by the room, and this still applies to you. It applies to the common parts, the exterior doors and walls, and those that separate flats or HMO bed sit rooms from the common parts. And the requirements are that fire safety instructions must be displayed in a conspicuous part of the building, showing things like the evacuation strategy, how to report a fire, the address of the landlord, and any other instruction. And you must provide information on fire doors to occupants. So tell them to keep them shut, don't tamper with the self-closures, etc. It must be given to new tenants as soon as practicable and reissued every 12 months. There are extra requirements for higher buildings. So buildings over 11 metres, there's a responsible, a named responsible person must check the fire doors every 3 months and check that the flat entrance doors every 12 months still comply with fire regulations. And if it's over 18 metres, the responsible person, this is obviously more high-rise blocks, also has to provide those additional things listed there. I expect that doesn't affect many of you, but if you're managing a high-rise building, I expect you'll be well aware of that kind of stuff. Just to remind you about smoke and carbon monoxide regulations, you do have to have a carbon monoxide detector now in every room with combustible fuel appliances except gas cookers from the 1st of October 2022, so that's been in for a little while. So that really means where you've got a gas boiler now. I had to buy, I think it was 13 CO detectors and took them around to all of my properties to make sure that there was one where the gas boiler is, and your gas safety certificate will identify whether that is there or not, and it must be there. The smoke alarm requirements also been extended to social housing, they have to have one on each floor, and of course there are different requirements for HMOs. You may have to have them actually in the bedrooms if it's a bedsit HMO. You have to test both types of alarms at the start of the tenancy. There's also a new requirement for the landlord to repair alarms if they're informed by the tenant that they're not working, but the tenant is responsible for testing them during the contract. Now, local authorities can issue an improvement or hazard awareness notice to say that the alarms must be mains interconnected, but otherwise you can still have battery operated alarms in properties where there's a family. If it's an HMO and it's more than 2 or more households, 3 or more people living in 2 or more households, then you should have mains interconnected smoke alarms. Right to rent changes are a little bit complicated, so if you haven't done these for a while, just Google government right to rent changes and you'll be able to see a full briefing. It's now called an unlimited right to rent or a time limited right to rent. So those who have an unlimited right to rent are UK and Irish nationals. EU nationals have to provide a residence card or evidence of settled status. Now, quite a lot of people have pre-settled status. So they come into this category of people with a time limited right to rent. So once you've checked their documents, then that's okay for 12 months, and you will need to check again after 12 months. And if they haven't sort of got their visa or new documents in order, then you would have to notify the Home Office. Note that there's this list now of USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and South Korea. So they all automatically have this 12 months time limited right to rent. They would need to provide a passport and proof of entry into the country in the last 6 months. Excuse me. COVID adjusted checks are no longer permitted, so we're not allowed to do it by video and so on. You have to actually use a certified provider to perform a digital check now. And there is always the government's landlord checking service. If you're uncertain, you can go in there and put the tenant's details in, and they have to get back to you within a certain amount of time. Just to remind you that Renting Homes Wales has totally changed tenancy agreements in Wales. So if you're renting in Wales, make sure you're on top of all of this. If you just Google Renting Homes Wales, you'll be able to see all of that. Is now a good time to invest in property? I'm going to finish off now with a bit of a sort of business orientation and, you know, something on investing. Well, these are the current challenges, and this is, of course, why some landlords are selling up. Construction costs and shortage of labour have been a big issue in the last 18 months or so. Increased finance costs due to rising bank base rate, lender caution as well, and high stress tests have made it harder to get mortgages. Falling house prices, we'll have a look at that shortly. Unfavourable taxation, so Section 24, additional stamp duty, worsening capital gains tax. We're all worried that it's going to go up from 28% to 40% at some point. Corporation tax has gone up from 19% to 25% for businesses with profits of 250,000 or more. Between 50,000 and 250, there's a tapered rate, but it's effectively 25% or more, and it's only 19% under 50,000 now. The costs, restraints and bureaucracy, of course, of licensing and HMO Article 4 directions is also huge frustration for many landlords. And typically when local authorities consult on licensing, 70 to 80% of landlords say that they don't want it. But unfortunately, local authorities have broad sweeping powers and they are able to bring in licensing regardless of landlords' views. There's also impending regulation, of course, which I've already outlined, like the Renters Reform Bill and minimum energy efficiency standards. And as I mentioned earlier, 30% of landlords do plan to sell in the next 12 months, according to NRA research, but 9% do plan to buy. And I met quite a few of those at the Property Investor Show, which was interesting. Now let's have a quick look at the inflation projection. You'll see that line, the orange one in the middle there, that's where the main point, that's where we think inflation is going to go. So it's expected to drop to 2.9% by the end of this year. And that's important because if it does go down, then we're going to see the Bank of England hopefully start to reduce bank base rate. The problem at the moment is that food inflation is currently 19.1%. So although overall inflation is 10.1%. It didn't go down as much as we'd have hoped this month. It went down from 10.4 to 10.1. We'd hoped it would go below 10%. because food inflation is 19.1%, it's being kept a bit higher than expected. Basically, all those transport costs, the cost of producing food are taking a while to sort of work through the system, and they're still pushing food prices up. And we don't think it'd be till sort of June or July before food price inflation starts to come down. So that's a big concern, and it's one of the reasons why we think bank base rate will continue to go up. This is from Capital Economics. It's looking like, I'm very loath to say this, but I think we could end up with 4.5% on the 11th of May and 4.75% on the 22nd of June. I'm hoping that will be the peak. I've been telling people to get trackers, but it looks like if you can still get a cheapish fix. I've just trying to fix on one of my mortgages now at 4.29%. because the tracker was 4.49, and I thought, well, by the time we've got another 0.5%, that's going to be 4.99. That's with Nationwide, but actually Nationwide's just changed their rates. I managed to get the old rate because we got the application in at the last minute, and it's still being processed. We'll see where that goes. But you know, their 2-year fix is now 4.59. You know, so the rates are going up to reflect the fact that bank base rate is going up. So we're going to go through a tricky period again in the next few months. Predictions are that prices will fall between 5 and 12% in the next in this year, and the Nationwide index shows that UK a fall of 3.1% in house prices in the 12 months to March 2023, which is the largest annual drop since July 2009. Mortgage approvals are at the weakest since January 2009. And there's been a fall in buyer interest with fewer first-time buyers and buy-to-let purchases. Interesting to see on the Rightmove data that the average time to secure a buyer did peak at 74 in January, but it's starting to drop again. And some people think from the market, it's not all doom and gloom, and the market's getting a bit better already. So who knows? It's a kind of watch this space, isn't it? And see. That's the end of what I wanted to say to you, and that's my half hour up. Just to mention the podcast, Listen Up Landlords, which you might be interested in. I interviewed Clive Betts, who is the chair of the Housing Select Committee, on that their report on the Renters Reform Bill. You might be interested to listen to that. Just Google Listen Up Landlords, and you should get the podcast. Also, if you'd like to join the NRLA, we'd be delighted for you to join. It's £85 per year by direct debit, but if you use my discount code, which has changed to 59, actually, sorry, it shouldn't say R59, it's 59 is the discount code, 59. That will give you £15 off. So do join using my discount code at 59. That's 59, and that will give you £15 off. And just to make you aware of forthcoming meetings, there is one in Camden I discovered today, not yet advertised. Sorry, I don't know where the venue is all the time, but all I know at the moment is it's on 17th of May. So if you keep an eye on the NRLA website, we'll put it up there as soon as we get more details. There's the Barking and Dagenham one on the 6th of June at Barking Town Hall. That's in person. The Newham one's also in person at Stratford Old Town Hall on Wednesday, the 28th of June. And we will also be at the National Landlord Investment Show on the 4th of July. And if you Google that, you'll get more details. There's not very much on the website at the moment, but it will get put up there as soon as we know more. And just to remind you, that's the advice line number, and there's the 3 London reps if you want to contact us. And of course, I'm one of the London reps, and I cover East and North East London. So that's the end of my presentation. I will just come out now and stop sharing. There we go. Obviously, I haven't had time to look through the questions. So what I'm going to suggest we do is go straight on to our next speaker. And then once he has finished, that's Tim Frome, I'll be looking obviously through the questions to see if anything's come up that you'd like me to answer. So we'll move straight on to Tim Frome now. And Tim Frome is Head of Partnerships at Hamilton Fraser. He's a super knowledgeable guy who's going to be telling us about insurance. And we're going to ask the question, are you underinsured? So Tim, are you there? Hello, Tim. Oh, I can't hear you, Tim. You are there, good.
Right. I was muted.
No worries.
Usually the case with these things. Right, okay, let's see if I can work out how to share my presentation from here. Am I being given some special?
There we go. We can see it, Tim. Yeah, well, I can see it now. I can see you, but not the presentation yet.
Have
you go up
share.
to that?
Here we go.
Share
Yeah,
at the top. Yeah.
Got it.
Great. We just need to go on to slide mode. Away we go. Brilliant. Thanks,
There we
Tim.
go.
Over to you.
Right. Evening all. So thank you very much, Richard, for that introduction. Thank you for inviting me on today. So yes, what is happening in the insurance industry? I'm here from Total Land Insurance, who are the NRLA's affiliate insurance partner. So we've been working with the NRLA since the merger between the NLA and the RLA, but we've been working with previously the NLA for many years. And anyone that can see the slides can see a little bit about information about us. But I'm going to go straight into the current conversations that are happening in the property industry at the moment about insurance, and the issues that we are seeing are underinsurance, index linking, premium increases, claims inflation, and policy coverage. So I'm going to try to explain to everybody what each of these things mean and what you need to consider when it comes to purchasing insurance for your property to make sure that you do not fall foul of any of these particular issues. So we shall start with underinsurance. So what is underinsurance? When you take out your landlord's insurance for the property, the way that the price is worked out is based on the actual rebuild value of the property. It's not actually on the purchase price or the market value of the property. And the reason for that is if there is a problem with the property, basically the reason why you're getting the insurance and work needs to be done, then it's actually the value of putting the property right which needs to be taken into consideration. So basically, if you are insured for less than the rebuild value, and I'll explain a little bit about how the rebuild value is worked out in a couple of slides, then this would mean that you are actually underinsured. And in the event of a claim, no matter what the claim was for or how much the claim was going to pay out, what would happen is the insurers would look at the actual rebuild value of the property at that point in time and potentially work out a average based on how much you have declared the rebuild value being, and this could mean that the percentage of the claim that is paid by the insurance company could be reduced. So if you if your policy was purchased and it was at 100% of the rebuild value, so you were correctly insured, then there wouldn't be a problem. The claim would be paid out at 100%. But in the situation where you have an underinsurance, the claim would be less. So the payout would be less. So calculating your rebuild value, it needs to be the total cost of the rebuild needs to be calculated, and this includes from the foundations up. You also need to take into consideration demolition, the cost of materials, and also the professional fees for a large-scale job that might require the rebuild of the property. So you have to think about your architects and your surveyors, and these can potentially add up to 15%. So the costs that need to be taken into consideration are the actual cost of the rebuild of the structure, the demolition and removal of debris, the labour and material costs, and also any local authority or professional fees. So as we know, the current economic climate, and particularly with everything we've been hearing about this evening, with specific costs that landlords may be facing at the moment, there is a temptation potentially to reduce the rebuild value. But as I've just explained, if you do this, the risk is that if you then have a claim and then the rebuild value is calculated at claim stage, it may end up that you do not get the full amount. And if this is the case, you may want to have a look at how much cover you get over your total policy, as that might be a way of reducing the cost rather than reducing the sums insured, the rebuild value. And then, so here's an example. So we've got a claim that came in here. So 2001, receiving a storm damage claim. So this was heavy rain causing ingress to the ground floor of a 3-bedroom property. A huge amount of damage caused to the lounge, the kitchen and the hallway. But at the time of the claim, the property was insured for a rebuild cost of £280,000, when really it should have been for £400,000 if the proper calculation was carried out. So although the claim was accepted and we were happy to pay out on the basis of the claim that was received, because of the under insurance that was involved here, only 70% of that actual claim was paid out. So although the storm claim was for £55,000, when the insurers calculated that the under insurance and applied the average, the actual amount that the landlord received was only £38,500. But if they had have actually declared the full amount of the £400,000, sorry, when they purchased the property, then they would have got the full amount of the £55,000. This is something you really do need to take into consideration when you're declaring the amount that you need to be covered. So how to avoid it? You can have the property professionally valued every 5 years. You need to be thinking about valuations all the time. There's certain things that can occur. You can have prices increasing in certain areas if, say, a new school was built, or there's examples of a Waitrose being built in a local area, and this having quite a big impact on local house prices. You also want to consider making sure that your policy is index linked. I'm going to talk a bit more about index linking in a couple of slides, but this is something that would mean that the policy naturally when it comes to renewal, an index linking is placed, which would mean that you don't have too low a rebuild value. And then another thing you can do, there's actually a calculator that can be applied, and that's run by an organisation called the BCIS. I've put a link there, but if anyone needs it, obviously they can get it off the slides. But type BCIS into Google or what have you, and then the calculator can come up, and that's a useful tool to use. So index linking, which I just mentioned. Index linking is a way of making sure that the value of a financial product is protected against rises in the costs to the wider economy. So it's basically linked to inflation. The facility is put in place to track rises in costs, inflation, cost of living, and then that percentage is applied to the value of the product. And this is something that's specific in all financial service products. So when you hear about car insurance all going up, that will be linked to that could be linked to inflation and cost of living, but it may also be linked to whatever the claims history of all the insurers are facing when it comes to insuring cars. So this is linked to it's called an index linking, and this happens in property because there might be a particular year where there was a lot of storm damage, and that's had an impact on the insurance market as a whole, meaning that all the policies are impacted. This can also go the other way, so that you have the advantage where there might be a year where it's very dry, so there aren't very many storm or water ingress type claims, and this would actually reduce the policy all round. But that index linking is something that's industry wide for each different type of policy. Just to give some calculations here, it's currently running at about 18%, which means that if you bought your policy last year for a sum of money, this year, just naturally, when it comes to renewal, an 18% increase will be applied to it. And this is nothing to do with the fact that the insurance company is just trying to get more money out of you. This is because this is seen as the increase in risk to the insurance company of the value of the possible claim based on what we know and what's going on in the economy. So that's what index linking means. And if you ever hear that term, how's it increased? Well, some of the reasons why it's increased recently, and these are some of the things that Richard mentioned. The cost of materials have now reached a 40-year high. The annual growth being in excess of 20%, and this was from a low of under 1% in June 2020. But obviously we know there were particular reasons for what happened in early 2020. And just basically the stopping of everything that was, a lot of things that was going on. This brought the index linking right down because the risk was seen as lower. But unfortunately, what's happened now recently with the demand for everything that's going on, that's meant that it's all increased again. We also know that there's a shortage of skilled labour in this country, triggering wage rises, which means that if you need to get labour, you need to get builders to do the work. That's all gone up as well. the B word is sometimes taken into consideration here as well. I know that's not always politically liked, but unfortunately it is a fact that Brexit has resulted in some shortages in specific industries, and building is one of them at this point in time. We've also obviously got the war in Ukraine, which has had an impact on energy prices for everybody. And as you can imagine, when you're undertaking large scale or even small scale construction works, a lot of energy is needed, and this can also result in increased prices. So how an index linking insurance policy protects you. This is where index linking and underinsurance are connected. So if your policy and the policy that you purchase has index linking in place, what it should do is help mitigate against the possibility that when you renew your policy, you're not actually fully insured for the amount needed, because the value has gone up, the amount of the rebuild cost has gone up without necessarily you knowing it. The index linking tracks this, so that should mean that if you've got your policy that has the index linking in place, you're not going to have that problem when it comes to renewal and then you have a claim. So it's certainly something to have a look at. Right, next, so policy coverage. So this is something that you need to think about. Here I have put down the kind of key things that you need to look at when it comes to your property insurance. This would be similar to even when you get your home insurance to a landlord insurance policy, but obviously you need to make sure that the buildings are all covered. So the structure of the building, the foundations, the walls, the windows, the roof, everything within the building is actually covered, and that's kind of a given when it comes to buying landlord insurance policy. But you want to just make sure that everything is there and in place. Then some other things that you want to think about specifically when it comes to landlord insurance are is there malicious damage by the tenants and the guests covered? Because obviously you've got your tenants in your property, they will have guests as well. Unfortunately, either during the tenancy or particularly sometimes what we see is that right at the end of the tenancy, there can be some malicious damage undertaken, and you need to decide whether you want to have that covered. You've then got theft by tenants and their guests. So if the property has contents in there, and there's the possibility that some of the contents could get stolen, you might want to decide whether you include theft of your tenants. Then there's also loss of rent and alternative accommodation that's needed. So if something happens to the property and the tenants need to move out while you are getting the work undertaken, then the policy can cover the costs involved in finding the tenants with alternative accommodation and or covering the rent while that work is being undertaken. You also got to take into consideration the cover that is provided if that property is unoccupied. So you're likely to have a period of time between one tenant moving out and one tenant moving in. So this is something you might need to consider depending on the area, how long the void periods are at that point in time. Terrorism is a bit of a niche issue, but it's something that you can get covered. Then property owners' liability. This is to do with people having any kind of specific personal type injury on the property. So say something has occurred in the property which has resulted in someone having a personal injury, you need to be covered for that. The most common sort of things are things falling down. So you might have a tree in your garden happens to fall over and it squashes either a car or, God forbid, an actual person. There's obviously going to be a liability involved with that, and that's what you need to make sure you have as cover. And then again, depends on your kind of risk appetite, how much you want cover there. You then might want to think about your excess, and again, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. Then, yeah, malicious damage. Sorry, these are the excesses. These points are how much the excess is for the if the things occur. So with malicious damage by tenants and guests, there is an excess involved if you want to make a claim on that, but it's usually worth it because the amount of cost involved in putting the property back when there has been a serious malicious damage claim is going to be far higher than £1,000. So you want to, particularly if there's been a cannabis farm or something like that at the property which is completely changed the structure of the property and caused all kinds of damage, you're going to want to pay the excess to cover the rest of the costs. And then escape of water excess is just a standard type of excess that you'd have to pay if there's been a leak or something like that in the property that has then caused some damage. So that's the excess that's in place. And things for you, an amount of money that you need to consider. So are insurers likely to increase their standard excess? Again, this is something that you might want to have a look at, and if you're doing any kind of policy comparison, you'll be able to see how much the excess is for various things. If you ever go on any of the comparison websites, you can usually use sliders to have a little bit of play about with the excesses for the different issues, and that can have an impact on the price that you pay. But at Total Land Insurance, we have a standard excess of £250 for the water, and that, despite what you're seeing with index linking and what have you, we keep into that. But again, as I say, something that you really want to have a think about. But also a tip here is that instead of thinking about trying to reduce the amount of the sums insured, you might want to increase your excess instead, because that would be a thing that would keep your actual policy cover correct, but you might keep the price might come down a little bit, but then if there is a claim, you'd have to pay a bit more. So that's something for landlords to consider when they're purchasing their policy. And here we go, we've got a bit of a landlord insurance checklist. So things to think about are making sure that it accommodates for all types of tenants. So if you're if you've got benefit tenants, students, retired or professional tenants, make sure that there's no difference in the cover or price, or if there is, the reason why a particular insurance company might have changed the price depending on the tenant. Have a think about your void periods. So again, we can cover up to 90 days of a void period as part of the policy. Have a think about the theft by tenants and their guests. Whether there's loss for rental income and alternative accommodation, because again, not all of the policies will cover that, particularly for the more basic ones, which are just for the property themselves. And again, depending on the type of tenants you have in and the kind of risk element that's occurring in the property, you might want to have a think about whether malicious damage by tenants and their guests is required. And a USP that we have at Total Land Insurance is that we have an in-house claims team who have the authority to make payments on behalf of insurers. And what this means is that a claim will be dealt with very quickly and all in-house, and we've got the authority to just make the payment straight away on a claim. We don't have to go through the insurer if the claim is under £50,000. So this is something that's helpful, particularly if you need to get something dealt with quickly. So yeah, potentially a little bit of a dry subject, but it is a very important subject and something that you need to consider, and making sure that for every property that you own, it is your income, it is an asset, and you want to make sure that you have the correct insurance in place. Otherwise, it could end up costing you a lot of money.
Thank you, Tim. And of course, this claims issue is important, isn't it? I did make a claim. It was a different insurance provider, and they used the third-party claims handling company that were absolutely diabolical. You know, so not just. So that thing about having an in-house claims processing team is actually quite a USP, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It's very important.
I mean, not all claims handling. Outsourced claims handling is bad, but you know, there is just that worry.
That's the risk. Obviously, we do have to use loss adjusters, and we have a loss adjuster company, but because we deal with them directly and we have a very good relationship with them, we make sure that they are on the scene quickly, and they are not necessarily working for the insurance company, if I can say it that way. They are there to support the customer. So
a quick question from me, Tim. I noticed with residential, not with buy-to-let or let property insurance rather, with residential, sometimes you have a policy that says it's unlimited. So the building sum insured is unlimited.
Unlimited.
Can underinsurance occur in those circumstances, or
not in a situation? No, if you've made the decision to purchase an unlimited policy that has unlimited, then obviously that covers you in all eventualities. Interesting, because the landlord policy is designed to be for businesses, and it's cut to the bone, if you see what I mean, to make it as cost effective for
Yes.
the landlord as possible. That's why with landlord insurance, it generally tries to allow for the fact that there will be different values and to price it accordingly.
For residential, sometimes
Yeah,
lenders, because they're looking,
yeah.
rather insurers are looking at volume, so they will just go with unlimited. So and that's
right.
So we should stress that's only a residential product, not a let property product.
That's correct.
There's some questions now. Actually, somebody was saying, let's have a look about it's interesting, this business of getting a building sum insured valuation. Of course, when you get a mortgage valuation done for a lender, that will usually have the figure on, and that's the one that I usually use. Somebody asks here, it's Fabiola, says, do you go by the RICS valuation to rebuild? It always seems to be on the low side. Well, it will be on the low side if it was done some time ago. But certainly when if it was done, for example, I've just had a building valued a couple of weeks ago, so I've informed the insurer of what the value, the sum insured, what the rebuild cost is, and so they've now adjusted the policy accordingly. So that's what we should be doing, isn't it, Tim? Is that right?
That's what you should be doing. I don't know if the slide has come back up on the screen for everybody else.
Yes,
but there is a calculator there, and I would recommend everyone go to the BCIS website when they're undertaking this task. I think it's something that we've just upgraded our system actually, and it's possible that the BCIS have a kind of clever technological widget which is going to allow us to actually be able to give you this figure straight away, and that's something in our roadmap. So hopefully, well, at least by this time next year, we'd have it. So if anyone that gets a quote directly through us, it will be 100% correct in terms of being able to give you the rebuild value. But in the
Tim,
meantime,
if say you get a rebuild value from that calculator, and then you make a claim, and the insurer says no, the rebuild value was wrong, would you be able to say, but I looked it up on the calculator, and that's what it told me?
Exactly, yeah, I'd keep a record, and also the rebuild values that are worked out by the insurance company are only going to be based on that.
Oh, I see.
So
okay,
yeah,
right.
that's how they get it. That's how
so we don't have to pay. We don't have to pay £200 to a valuation company to get a professional valuation done. Then
no, just use the calculator.
Just use the calculator. Okay, great, right.
Yeah.
That's good to hear, because I hadn't heard that in the past. Right, haven't got any more questions, I don't think, on insurance. I'm just having a look through. No. Well, Jane asks, how much does it cost to rebuild a late Victorian terrace house? Well, that's the issue, really. How long is a piece of string? That is the problem.
Yeah, that is the issue. Yeah.
Depends on the area, the size, whether it's a terrace house, all kinds of things, doesn't it? Really.
Whether you need listings approval.
There is this issue as well of the standard to which the house has been built, isn't there, Tim? So, for example, somebody's own home may be built to a higher spec than your average property because they might have invested a lot of money in it. So perhaps that's when an unlimited policy comes in, I guess, is it? Yeah,
well, if there's very specific alterations have been made to a property to make it of a very high value, and that you'd want to be put back into the place you were in previously, which is what insurance is there for. That's where an unlimited would help. But if that was the case, then you'd need evidence of the fact that the property was in that level of quality beforehand. So I would recommend keeping quotes and receipts and all that kind of stuff.
And we're likely to have photos. We're likely to have photos, I guess, of let properties, aren't we, because of inventories, but we might not have photos of our own home.
Of your own property. No. Yeah.
So a good point, isn't it? Yes.
And interestingly, for some of the more higher value properties, we are seeing that now. So people are actually undertaking and check-in inventory style document for this exact purpose.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we don't seem to have any more questions, but I think that's partly because that was very thorough. And thank you very much indeed, Tim. It's very interesting. No, I'm a bit of a mortgage and insurance geek, so I quite enjoy this kind of stuff. And it's important to remind people that not all insurance policies are the same, are they? And sometimes, Total Landlord might come out a little bit more expensive, but actually check, do a thorough check to see what Total Landlord offers as compared to other insurance providers. So
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, Tim.
No, pleasure. Thank you.
Now, I think we're coming to the end of the webinar. I can see that most questions have been answered in the chat. So thank you very much to colleagues who've been doing that. And if you could unshare your screen now, Tim, that would be good.
There you go.
Now, remember that you can get access to a recording of tonight's webinar on the Redbridge Landlord Forum website. So do go there and have a look. We are looking at a date for the next webinar. Not sure if this is confirmed yet, and Misha might be able to let me know, but we were looking at 7 to 9 p.m. on the 5th of October. Do we think that's confirmed yet, Misha?
Yes, that's confirmed, Richard. That's in everyone's diary, so we'll let you all know close to the date and fill you in on the agenda for that.
Great. So thank you very much, Misha. So do pop that in your diary so that you've got that in there, save the date. We did get over 250 people sign up tonight, which is fantastic. So it's great to have such a good response, and we hope you found at least some aspects of the webinar, if not all of it, useful. Okay, well, I'm going to say a very big thank you to all of our guest speakers tonight. Thank you also to all of those of you who've tuned in to the webinar, and I hope we'll see you again in October. But for the time being, thanks very much, and good night to everyone. Thank you and good night.
Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks,
everyone.
everyone. And thanks to all our presenters and to you all for coming. See you soon.
Thank you all.
See you soon. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.